Good morning and welcome to the Social Justice Forum this Sunday. My name is Karen Keppel, a member of Westminster's Social Justice team. Our Social Justice Forum's focus this program year is acting based on our values and avoiding despair, in which we will seek to understand our continuing responsibility to help build a loving, sustainable, and just community. Today, we're pleased to welcome back Julia Decker, Policy Director for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, where she oversees policy and advocacy work. She has worked on immigration cases at all levels of the immigration system, up to and including the U.S. Supreme Court. This morning, Julia will be addressing immigration law and policy, understanding where we are. Given the ongoing and rapid developments on the ground around immigration law and policy, please join us in an open roundtable discussion, an opportunity to ask questions about things that have happened and are currently happening, what is being learned in real time, and what our communities are preparing for in the future. To get us started, we've asked members of the social justice team and some congregational members to contribute questions. First, though, a few logistical items. For those attending in person, we'll bring a microphone to you to share questions and comments, so all those, including on the live stream, can hear your concerns. If we don't use the microphone, they can't hear us. For those attending on the live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat, and we'll monitor that and raise your questions and concerns. As part of our ongoing effort to promote respectful conversations, this way, we've established guidelines for our conversations. Please take a minute to look at what you're seeing. Now, those are those are our guidelines. Please take a look at those and keep those in mind as we join together in conversation and learning this morning. Before we get started, though, let's have a short prayer if we can. Let us pray. Holy One, God of justice, breathe into us today a spirit of curiosity and humility. Help us engage with mindfulness, following the lead of our voices from our community. Guide our speech and our self-awareness so we may honor the divine in all people. Amen. So now please welcome Julia Decker, and she'll present comments and information to us first, and then we'll follow up with some questions. Thank you, Julia, and welcome.
Great, thank you. Great. So thank you so much for having me back here. I know I've been here with you a couple times to sort of present sort of updates on what's going on, immigration, sort of 101 topics. And we are now just about 10 months into the current administration. We have seen just sort of onslaught of changes, rapid policy developments in immigration law and policy, and in discussing with Karen and sort of the committee about how do we want to sort of update folks on what has been going on. Even since the May update, it was sort of like, well, I could talk at you for just, an hour or so about everything that has happened, but that would quite frankly just be overwhelming because there has been so much that has happened. It would just be like, I would just be throwing information at you. It would be bullet point after bullet point, and it would just not probably actually be, it would just be incredibly depressing and scary, and it would just be despair, quite frankly. And so I think in a lot of ways, what we wanted to do was take some time to see what you are most interested in, hopefully give you a perspective of what we are seeing on the ground, what we are actually learning, what we are trying to do to learn from what we are seeing, and how we are trying to hopefully fight back, and give you a chance to ask questions. What are you hearing in the news? What are maybe some of the myths that you are hearing? What can we help maybe clear up? And just understand. I mean, so much has happened. So much is happening. Even, Phil and I were talking about even just between like Friday and today, a lot has happened in Chicago and Portland and beyond. So yeah, I mean, that's the world that we're living in. 24 hours can make a huge difference in the immigration world. So that is what we are hoping to do today. I want it to be a conversation. I don't want this to just be me talking at you. Immigration is really complex. I think I have said this to folks before. This is a really, really complicated area of law and policy as is. It is even more complicated and complex now. It is changing really quickly. I think we are in a place where the rule of law is very much changing and sort of we are in a state of crisis, quite frankly. And so trying to understand what our role even as lawyers is also in a state of flux. So those are all like fair game questions when we were talking about what does it mean to be engaging in lawyering and the practice of law, as well as just sort of democracy and voting and those sorts of things. So that's what we are doing. That is my contact information. I will just run through, I want to just sort of note a couple things that obviously are happening and have happened, the big things, maybe just to jog people's memory. Obviously, we have the National Guard deployments, right? Chicago, Portland, they have happened in Los Angeles. There's, I think, still a few troops in Los Angeles on the ground. DC, they have been voluntarily deployed by the governor in Memphis as well. There are a few troops that have been deployed in places like Iowa and Missouri as well, and obviously have been threatened in other places, so continue to monitor those. There was a ruling, intermediate sort of ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States on essentially racial profiling in immigration arrests. Was not really meant to be a nationwide ruling, but has had sort of nationwide implications, particularly in the Chicago context, where we have had a quote by the chief of the Border Patrol, who is currently in charge of operations in Chicago, essentially stating that they are using outward racial appearance as one of the grounds for whether they decide to arrest somebody on the ground. We have the government shutdown, which is, of course, causing additional chaos in the operations of immigration across the board, enforcement, as well as just things like interviews, naturalization, processing of applications, things like that. There was the budget bill that was passed by Congress, which is going to have long-ranging implications for things like health benefits for refugees, for asylees, for trafficking victims, for domestic violence victims, for children, for families, people who have lawful status, as well as families who might be mixed status. So you might have family members who have varying types of immigration statuses, whether documented or undocumented, and those are taking effect over time. And then there was a Washington Post article that mentioned the possibility that there will be the opening of the Appleton prison here in Minnesota to use for ICE detention, potentially before the end of this year. We have not seen that actually happen yet, but it was mentioned as fairly likely to happen. There have also been lawsuits against Minnesota, as well as Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Hennepin County on a variety of issues. Some of those are in sort of abeyance. They're sort of on hold because of the government shutdown, but they haven't been dismissed or anything. And then various types of, firings and purges at all levels of the Department of Justice, particularly in the immigration system, so immigration judges and the sort of appeals system of the immigration courts of, judges that were hired under the previous administrations. And for sort of a very brief review, immigration judges and immigration courts are not part of the federal judiciary. These judges are employees of the Department of Justice. So they are employees under the executive branch, which means they can be hired and fired by the executive branch. They are not judges of the federal bench. So those are all things that have happened fairly recently within the last maybe couple months. And we have not yet reached a year under the current administration. And these are things that have happened just, yeah, fairly recently. If we go back further, many, many other things have happened. But just to sort of set a little bit of the stage. So.
Thank you, Julia. I guess let's just start where you left off.
Yes.
With all of these rapid fire changes, how is your office and comparable offices in the state of Minnesota responding to your client needs? I mean, how do you help people in this climate that changes constantly?
So one of the biggest things that our and other offices are doing is to try and staff up deportation defense. So making sure we are bringing in attorneys to work with people and represent people who are in immigration court. This has always been a need, right? Because there's always going to be people in immigration court who are going to need representation. But it is going to be an ever-growing need as more and more people are detained. You may have seen that the detention numbers are the highest recorded, and they continue to meet, to set new records of detention, at least as they have been recorded. Immigration detention continues to rise to new record levels. They continue to open new detention centers. So hiring new attorneys and looking for ways to fund new positions for removal defense. We are also making sure that we are communicating accurate information to people whose cases are pending, whether that's immigration court or it's all these other types of cases. So many different types of statuses, whether it's green cards or temporary protected status or asylum. Lots of these cases are undergoing changes, and it might be, oh, you now have to pay additional fees every year. Like if your case is processing for a year or 2 years, you might have to pay a fee every year. So we have to make sure, okay, now every person that is in our case files, you've got to now pay $100 every year that your case is waiting. Or, oh, you're on this type of status, that case is now being litigated, you might not be able to renew your work authorization as long as that case is pending because, whatever the court said, right? And just making sure that all those updates are being accurately communicated because many things that are said in the news might not be entirely accurate, right? That can be really tough because things are happening really, really rapidly. I mean, you will see a lawsuit filed. As we have seen, you will see maybe an emergency motion. You might see an injunction within 24 hours, and within another 24 hours, you see an emergency stay. Then you see that stay halted, and then So again, like then all of these calls have to be made to all of the clients in case, and making sure they all understand. And that is right? That's a lot of work. B, that is also incredibly emotional for clients who are going, hey, wait a second. If my work authorization is terminated, or if my work authorization is no longer valid, I can't go to work and I can't feed my family. And a lot of folks, if their work authorization, that might be their only, like, quote unquote status, which is, there's legal ramifications around that. But setting that aside, a lot of these people, if they don't have that, they're not eligible for any type of benefits. SNAP, any type of those, benefits that citizens or green card holders are otherwise eligible for. A lot of these folks are not going to be eligible for those. So this is literally like nothing. I have no access to food. I may have no access to shelter if I lose this work authorization, right? So these are extremely heavy conversations in addition to, right, just we got to make this clear to our clients. And also, oh, by the way, I might be communicating like your entire life could be falling apart in this one phone call, right?
I just have one follow-up to that, and then I think maybe we'll open it up a bit to other questions. When you face a situation like that, and anecdotally, I think we all hear stories about uh, families who don't want to send their kids to school because they're afraid it'll be the means by which ICE comes in and takes the parents. Or if you're hearing that somebody's work authorization might be pulled and they don't have any access to services. Does your office dovetail your work with whether it be churches or social service agencies, the International Institute of Minnesota, or anything like that, so that there might be other ways to fill those gaps for people?
So we do our best. I think one of the difficulties, and this is a larger issue, right? And without, because this is not to, there are so many needs, right? That so many of these systems are simply overwhelmed with the needs that exist in the community. So when we ask a particular service provider, you know, can you take on, like a shelter, do you have beds for somebody who's losing their housing? You know, and it's a question of, I mean, they are weighing two families, right? They're going to have to make a call between our client and another client. You know, we can advocate for our client, and another service provider is going to be advocating for their client. I mean, that's not obviously we can't make that, that is an impossible choice then for another service provider to have to make, you know, because of course the need is too great. And we are asking them then to have to choose between two people whose needs are equally dire. So yes, we connect with as many of the additional service providers as there are out there, also recognizing that they, in the same vein as we are trying to meet a need that is excessive. And will only get, I think, more great given what we are facing economically and what is in the pipeline. Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
yeah.
Thank you, Julia. Are any questions? No, Dwayne?
Thank you. Focusing on our local scene, how many immigration court judges are there in Minnesota, and how are their dockets? Are they just overwhelmed? And then do appeals go to the Eighth Circuit or to the DC Circuit? And how is the DC Circuit or the Eighth Circuit reacting to all of these issues?
So there's two different, I'd have to check on the immigration judges locally, because there were just a bunch of firings, and there were several immigration judges locally who were part of those firings. So I'm not sure how many there are locally right as of this moment. I want to say there were like 7 or 8 at one point. I don't think it's that many right now. The national, there is, I'd have to look it up. I can look it up for you. The national backlog of immigration court cases that are pending is approaching something like 4 million. So, and that it's been growing ever since. So it's not getting better. You know, and the local court is certainly just part of that. It's not gotten better. And as they throw more people into detention, of course, that will just get worse. The shutdown will also not help that, because that will force more of those cases into sort of abeyance. The appeals out of immigration court, so this is the second part of that question. An individual's case, if you're in removal proceedings, you're facing deportation, If you lose your case before an immigration judge, your first appeal will go to what's called the Board of Immigration Appeals. That is still within the Department of Justice. It's within what's called the Executive Office of Immigration Review. That has also been the subject of a whole bunch of purges. So they've gotten rid of a whole bunch of the members of the Board of Immigration Appeals. I would have to look that up, but I want to say they've cut that from like a whole bunch of members down to like 13 or 17 or something like that. So it's gone down significantly to a much lower number than it was previously. And so those members would then decide any appeals of an individual person's removal case. If you then lose before that Board of Immigration Appeals, you can appeal from that board to a federal circuit court, whichever federal circuit court you are in the jurisdiction of. In Minnesota, you would be in the 8th Circuit. But in immigration, you are deported. Your removal order is final after you lose at the Board of Immigration Appeals. You are deported while your case goes to federal circuit court. So you could appeal, but you would be sitting outside the country while your appeal is pending. So, you could win, but you still might not be able to get back. If the cases that we see pending in federal circuit courts right now around things like birthright citizenship, the National Guard deployments, other sort of policies, those are not individual removal cases, and so that's why they're ending up in circuit court faster, because they're like what we call impact litigation cases. So those are around not an individual person's case, they're around policies that affect, groups of people. And so those go to, it's like, okay, we're suing the government around this policy that affects a whole bunch of people, right? And so we go to federal district court first. And if we lose before the district court, or if the government loses, one of the parties then appeals to a federal circuit court. There's a whole, I could rant for hours about what's going on in the litigation context. As a lawyer, we could go on and on and on and on about that. But yeah, so there's two pieces of immigration litigation. There's the removal context, and then there's the impact litigation context. So two different pieces of it.
My name's Sheila. Thank you, Julia, for your work and being here. Just an extension on the last question. Is that issue of someone being deported while their case is being appealed or pending, is that the same as it always was, or has something changed? Has something changed about that? That's just always how it's been.
It's always been like that.
Thank you.
For people who are in the midst of an asylum case, what protections do they have right now? And maybe there's sort of two parts to that, is what protections do they legally have? And then what protections do they actually have? Because I know that asylum process can take years, and it is a legal process. Like, people have the right to go through that process. And so what protections do they have along the way?
So there are two, to sort of set the threshold, there are two different ways that people can apply for asylum. One is the affirmative process, whereby a person is physically in the United States and they submit an application to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services within 1 year of arriving in the United States. So they say, I'm unable or unwilling to return to my country of origin because I'm afraid of, persecution. And they pursue that application before U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. They go through an interview process. The other process is the defensive process, which is through immigration court proceedings. In theory, people in either proceeding should have protection against deportation. Like, if they are picked up by ICE, right, and detained, they should not be deported before their case is adjudicated. under the law, right? The reality of that is that is not that is not happening in a lot of instances. Because the administration doesn't care, right? I mean, the administration, that would require the administration to be asking questions like, when they arrest people, like, are you afraid? Do you have an application? It would require them to be checking for applications that are in process before they put people on planes. That has not happened. I mean, we have seen that this has not happened. Kilmar Abrigo Garcia is a fairly clear example of this because he had he had withholding of removal status, which is a type of asylum. We can get into that, the legal technicalities of that if we want to, but right. So under the law, and this is where I think we get into this sort of like, under the law, there are a lot of protections that exist. Under the law, there are a lot of things that should exist. This administration has sort of blown a lot of those things out of the water. That there's a lot of things on paper. And the administration is just running roughshod over a lot of those things. Humanitarian protections like asylum, protections for trafficking victims, protections for domestic violence victims, yes. All of these people should be protected from, a lot of these people should be protected from detention in the first place. They shouldn't be detained, or they should only be detained under very certain circumstances. A lot of these people should not be under threat of deportation. A lot of these people, shouldn't be shackled. Right? All of these things are happening. And to be clear, I think, a lot of these things did happen under previous administrations. They were much more likely to be the subject of lawsuits and were much more likely to be the subject where you had more legal recourse, right? You used the courts, you went to court, you sued the government, you were more likely to have some sort of recompense from the government. It was more likely that if they wrongfully deported somebody, you were more likely to get them back if they screwed it up. Or if they were put on a plane, you were more likely to get them off the plane before they got sent to the wrong country. That is less likely now.
Where are the federal detention facilities here in Minnesota? And is Appleton still privately owned, and therefore the government would be trying to rent it out?
So the current places that hold ICE detainees are Sherburne County Jail, Freeborn County Jail, and Kandiyohi County Jail. Appleton is currently owned by CoreCivic, so it is privately owned. The company has owned it since it closed, which means that they could contract with ICE. And there's been an article, I think, that there's like an open discussions between the city and the company and ICE about trying to do that. So
if the detention center is a state approved, those are the county jails, what if any impact does Minnesota law or Minnesota folks have in overseeing and letting people in to see detainees at those state, even though they're not state run, but they're county run, as I understand it. Is that correct?
yes, so this is an interesting question. There is some level of state and potentially county oversight into the county facilities because they're county jails, right? So the State Department of Corrections does some licensing oversight. The Department of Health does some licensing oversight. There have been some discussions between advocates and the departments about like who has sort of responsibility over these things. But it gets very complicated because ultimately the agency that is responsible for the inmates is not the county or the Department of Corrections. It is ICE. It's the Department of Homeland Security. And so you get a little bit of a carousel of, well, it's them, it's not us. It's them, it's not us. And there's been some articles about, and it's not specific to Minnesota, but in other detention facilities, even those that are run by various states or counties, a lot of the services are also contracted out. So food service or health services, things like that. And so any sort of investigations or lawsuits into lack of medical care, lack of proper food or water or anything like that, again, you get this finger pointing of like, well, technically it wasn't us because the contractors are contracted for like 50% of the health services. So technically it wasn't us. Like, it really wasn't our fault. Like, you should really look at the contractors, and the contractors say, well, yeah, but 50% of it was the county. So really, you should look at the county, and the county would say, yeah, but it was only half. It wasn't us. And like, really, ICE is the one who's responsible for and so you see the way that this just becomes a mess of sort of passing the buck. And in the meantime, then the inmates are suffering and then deported. And it's horrendous, right? It's awful. And we have seen this too with the Everglades facility, the alligator Alcatraz, which I hate to even use the phrase because but this has happened with that lawsuit where again, it's been like, well, technically it was state money that was used. So, this whole federal lawsuit around the environmental impacts of it, when it went up to the federal courts, that was one of the arguments about like whose money was used to actually build the facility and run the facility, whose employees are being sort of used to run the facility, all these different trails of who's doing what become very, very relevant for the legal arguments, and are being used to sort of disclaim responsibility. And it makes it very, very difficult to actually pin down any sort of accountability for really terrible things that are happening to people inside the walls of those facilities.
Right behind you, James.
I'm curious if it may or may not be happening very much, but I'll call it a third country deportation. I assume the norm, if a person is deported, they're deported to the country they came from. That may or may not be right. Correct me if I'm wrong. But is it a new thing for the government to say, oh, well, we'll just send you to South Sudan. You won't like that. You won't like it there. Is that a new thing?
So the concept is not new. It was a thing that the United States could do, had the ability to do in the past. They did not typically do it previously, except in very rare circumstances, because it tended to be very inefficient. Like, it was very costly, because you would have to go to the country and sort of get like, permission from that country. Like, these are people who are not nationals or citizens or residents of those countries, which begs the question, what is happening here that all of a sudden we've got these third countries who are now saying, yeah, we will take flights of people who are not citizens or nationals of our countries. We are not seeing a lot of transparency around what these agreements are that they are now accepting or willing to accept planes of non-nationals into their countries. There is some reporting now. There was just some reporting this morning, I think, about the agreement with El Salvador, around some of the agreement to accept people into the prison there, and what that agreement with the president down there was, which seemed to be fairly eye-opening, I guess one could say. But when a lot of that information, or if and when it will come out, is unclear. So it was a possibility, but we are seeing it just being much more commonly used now, and in ways that it was not used previously. Yeah, and with very little transparency as to how these agreements are being come to, and what is happening to these people after they are removed. There is a lawsuit around some people who were removed to, I believe it was Ghana, and then subsequently were repatriated to their home countries, which is the whole point of like third country removals is, well, if we can't repatriate them, we can't remove them to their home countries because of persecution, torture, any number of reasons. Well, if we're just going to use third country removals as a workaround to that, then then we shouldn't be doing it, right? And apparently we did that with this at least one flight of people to Ghana, because they ended up in their home countries where they're potentially subject to torture and persecution. So if that is what is happening, that's a whole other issue. But we have not been able to get transparency around that either. The only reason this happened is because some of the lawyers were able to keep in contact with the people who were removed there and learned about what happened to them after they were removed.
Are you detecting any particular group of immigrants who are being targeted, such as people with temporary protected status or DACA, or any particular countries of origin? Is there any way to figure out why and how this is happening?
I mean, I would imagine there are. You could read the opinion from one of the justices in the racial profiling case that I think gave some pretty clear indications about where his mindset was at about what they think about certain immigrants and who they think certain populations are most likely to be, and who they think there would be like reasonable suspicion about. The reality is, I think that certain populations have always been more likely to be targeted by certain law enforcement agencies for policing, whether it's immigration or just policing in general. And that has always been a reality for certain populations in the United States. I think the current climate just allows that on a more large scale basis. I think it just makes it more violent, and I think it just makes it more dangerous, and more sort of arbitrary in a lot of ways. There was a story out of Chicago last week or so where a woman who was walking her dogs was stopped and detained by Border Patrol or ICE, one of the federal agencies, because she didn't look like her last name, because she's a Latina, but she's adopted, so she has a quote-unquote white last name. Presented without comment, I guess. So I think, population has the potential to be targeted. this administration has made a point of taking away lawful statuses though from folks, making it easier for people to be targeted. Yeah.
It seems to me that in a really broad way, due process of law is being disregarded. And I'm wondering if from a faith perspective for myself, what is it that we can do as a community to express our opposition to that? And for instance, is it now time for civil disobedience to come in as opposed to all the protests that happened yesterday, which in my opinion are not civil disobedience? What is your suggestion?
So I'm a lawyer, so I'm not like legally allowed to like counsel about.
Yeah.
I'm not. Yeah, I can't legally counsel about like breaking the law. What I would say is that I think even lawyers are going to have to ask ourselves very difficult questions about our participation in the system right now. And I've had this conversation with professionals in the legal profession as well as in other professions about like we are going to have to have some very difficult conversations with ourselves about what it means to participate in a system where we know that whatever we are doing is just furthering the system. Because and I have asked myself this question before, because the immigration system, even before this, was set up in a way that only sort of protects due process. Because if the immigration judge works for the Department of Justice and the DHS is always represented by an attorney, and an immigrant is only represented by an attorney sometimes, are you really upholding due process, by engaging in that system? Or are you just helping the system prop itself up? And you can have a very reasonable discussion about that. That is a very reasonable question to have a back and forth with very reasonable, smart, principled people about. I think it's a much more difficult question to ask yourself now. And I, quite frankly, have had, discussions with very good lawyers, very smart lawyers about this. Like, are we doing the right thing by engaging in this system, given what we know about the immigration judges who have been purged and the immigration judges who are left now? And the fact that they're using military judges. I didn't say that. They're using military judges in the immigration courts, by the way. So, these are real like questions that we have to ask ourselves, right?
Thank you, Julia, for sharing, especially like how you as a practicing attorney and other attorneys are thinking about this. I am your associate pastor for Justice and Mission, and I want to point you to 3 things over on this table. First, there is a sign up for an interfaith nonviolent civil resistance training that is being offered by the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University. It is online this Wednesday. And so if you've been wanting to get some skills, this is a very low barrier to entryway. Jane and I both have also been to training offered by Unidos, Minnesota. The second QR code I would point you to is the advocacy alert. We can always, again, this is a really easy way for us to register our concern, our anger, all of those things with our elected officials. And then finally, when all of that gets stirred up in us, we're going to go to this blue sheet, which is from the resources that Steve Palmer brought to us from the Counseling Center about how we can stay grounded so that we can stay active. And so what we're so grateful for partners like Julia is her willingness to come and take all of our questions, and then they tag it off to us and we figure out what is our faithful response. We are called to accompany, and what that looks like can be an advocacy alert. It can look like walking kids into schools so that their parents don't have to. It can look like us putting our bodies some places where we know our bodies won't be as challenged. I was really appreciative of how Julia very carefully had to answer that question. And so I'm just going to say that we can put our bodies in places that other people can't navigate as easily. So all kinds of ways, and I will turn it back over to Julia, and thank you, Karen, for more questions.
Hello. Does it come through? I was just wondering if you could quantify the number of how many people are potentially impacted? How many people are you servicing on a regular basis? Is there any way that you could kind of give me a feel for the numbers that we have?
Yeah, I don't know. Is there internet connection here? We have so ILCM has a, let me actually just, wonder if this will open up. We have our, so our 2024 general fact sheet. So this is from last year. So in last year, I don't know if this is not showing up. But so our fact sheet from last year, we provided legal services in 2,734 unique cases. So this was approximately 9,000 people, individuals that we served. And this included work by 194 pro bono attorneys. 2024. And there are other, so I will note that we are the main legal service provider that does strictly immigration legal services. There are others, so Minnesota Legal Aid also does immigration legal services, but they also do obviously lots of other legal aid. Advocates for Human Rights also does immigration legal services. They predominantly focus on asylum cases and like trafficking cases. International Institute does citizenship work. Southern Minnesota Legal Regional Legal Services does some adjustments cases, citizenship, some U visa, domestic violence, and trafficking work as well. But they also do a lot of other legal aid type work. So we are the one that does all the just immigration. We're the only one that does only immigration. So we try to cover as many immigration types of cases as possible.
What advice are you giving your clients right now in terms of just, obviously there's no guarantees, but things they can do in their day-to-day life to stay safer in the climate? And are there any of those things that could use help from groups or from individuals to help those people stay safe?
So yeah, so on our website, which the link is here, so we do Know Your Rights presentations, and we have Know Your Rights materials, both on our website, and then we also have them linked to the ACLU, which does a lot of Know Your Rights, both for just in your house and at your workplace, in your sort of, if you're driving, which I think is what you can do. Which is, has always been a really important thing, but especially now, because if you're likely to be encountered by any type of law enforcement, it's probably not necessarily going to keep you from being detained, but it may, help you in your legal case if you are detained. I think the reality is that a lot of people are just taking more proactive steps in their day-to-day lives, that we are not necessarily saying as legal advice, but it's just people are just staying home more. I mean, the reality is I think people are keeping their kids home from school. I think people are not going to things like medical appointments or church or social events as much just because of the fear. I mean, there have been I think articles about places like Lake Street are seeing the economic impact of people not going out as much. So, you know, I wish there was something really concrete that we could tell people like, oh yeah, this is going to keep you safe. But unfortunately, the actions of the administration have just been so brazen that I think Know Your Rights is really the only sort of the tool that we have, the legal tool that we have.
Julia, I just have one last question as a follow-up to Beth's question. Are there any resources where we could find ways to support people in that way? When you talk about helping children be able to attend school rather than staying home, you know, driving them to school, or whether it be the Lake Street businesses or others, maybe in you know, West St. Paul, South St. Paul, you know, some of the grocery stores to pick people up or, you know, go purchase their groceries for them and bring them home. Are there any ways that regular people can fill in the gaps for those who are afraid?
You know, I mean, I think all of those are good suggestions. I had been thinking about this as well recently. I think those are the kinds of things that have been sort of popping up organically in places like Chicago and Portland and Los Angeles when ICE surges and National Guard deployments happened. I think it would be a good idea for places like Minnesota to start thinking about those proactively, because I think it's a reality that we are likely to see a deployment like that here, whether it's, you know, right away or it's sort of in the not so distant future. I mean, the governor has also sort of indicated that he sees that as a likelihood. I think he's not wrong. And so if there are groups like this that are willing to start thinking proactively about that kind of infrastructure, that would be wonderful. Because I have certainly thought about that, and you know, if I had the sort of emotional and sort of capacity to think about it, I absolutely would. I just sort of am a little bit tapped out, to be honest. But it would be wonderful if there were sort of those networks of people who were like, hey, I will get your groceries for you. Like those are the kinds of things that would be really helpful for some of these communities, because it's the people going to the grocery store that are getting picked up a lot of the time. You know, and getting their windows broken in. You know, and those are the traumas that are going to, of course, live with the families for the rest of their lives. So,
thank you, Julia, and thank you again for all of the work that you do. We cannot imagine how trying it must be right now. And on the behalf of all your clients, we're so grateful, and thank you for sharing your insights and perspectives with us again. Next week, we will welcome Westminster Senior High Youth Group, and they'll share a presentation and guided conversation about their summer service learning trip to Billings, Montana, where they completed service projects with organizations committed to encouraging the flourishing of people in local neighborhoods. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for being here today.